She pulled away after holding your hand like it meant everything. And now, she barely meets your eyes.
You replay every word, every moment, trying to solve the mystery of what went wrong.
But here's what most men never learn. Her silence isn't always rejection. Sometimes it's a storm of emotion she doesn't know how to name. Fear dressed as indifference. Desire wrapped in doubt. And if you react too fast, too loud, too desperate, you'll lose her without ever knowing why. This isn't about chasing her. It's about becoming the one thing she can't pull away from. Calm, quiet strength. 1. Her fear of losing control, when love feels like drowning. A woman raised to survive, not surrender, carries her own war inside. In Boston's steel-grey skyline, Claire walked like she owned every block. Heels sharp, posture straight, eyes that didn't blink. Finance was her world. Deadlines, numbers, deals. Everything in her life fit inside spreadsheets and perfectly tailored suits. There was no room for chaos, no time for weakness, and certainly no tolerance for emotions that couldn't be solved with logic. Then came Adam. He wasn't loud, he didn't boast, he didn't try to impress her with grand gestures or clever lines. He simply noticed, like the way she stirred her coffee 3 times before sipping, or how her eyes softened when she looked at street musicians. He made space for her, not to impress, but to understand. And that terrified her, because for the first time in years, Claire wasn't in control. She was feeling things she couldn't file away or outthink. The idea of needing someone, of missing their voice at the end of a long day, that wasn't exciting. It was dangerous. It meant vulnerability. It meant the armor she'd built, layer by careful layer, was cracking. So she pulled back, texted less, cancelled dinner, took longer to respond. She told herself she was busy, that work came first. But deep down, it wasn't the job. It was fear. The kind that whispers, what if he leaves too? What if he sees all of me and decides I'm too much? Or worse, not enough? And yet, Adam didn't chase her. He didn't send paragraphs demanding answers. He didn't fill her silence with anxiety. He simply let her be, quiet, steady. And in that stillness, Claire felt something she'd almost forgotten existed: safety. Not because he needed her, but because he didn't need to prove himself. She realized then that love doesn't have to roar to be real. Sometimes it shows up like Adam, unshaken, unwavering, unafraid of a woman who's been taught to run. And in that space, the most fragile part of her, the part she buried beneath ambition and independence, began to breathe again. Because real love doesn't demand control. It invites surrender. And for a woman who's only ever known how to fight, that kind of love feels like drowning, until she realizes he's not letting her sink, he's teaching her to float. 2. She tests what you're made of, a trial by silence. Down in Austin, Texas, where the air smells like mesquite and music drips from every bar window, Marcus thought he had met someone unforgettable. Savannah. Her name rolled off the tongue like a song. She was fire wrapped in velvet, eyes that danced, laughter that filled a room, a confidence that made men forget their own names. But just as quickly as she came close, she pulled away. One day she was tangled in his hoodie on the back porch, talking about childhood dreams. The next, she was a ghost behind curt replies and missed calls. Most men would have panicked. Some would have begged. Others would have tried to pin her down with questions. What happened? What did I do? Are you okay? But Marcus, he didn't do any of that. He'd lived long enough to know that storms don't always need umbrellas. Sometimes they just need space to pass. So he waited, but not like a man in limbo. He lived. He went to the gym. He showed up for his nephew's ball game. He laughed with friends, let the silence speak for itself, and never once tried to turn it into a spotlight. And that silence? It echoed louder than words ever could, because Savannah wasn't pulling away out of cruelty. She was watching, testing, not in a calculated way, but from a place deep inside her that needed to know. Can I trust him not to fall apart when I get scared? Can he hold his own when I retreat into mine? She had been burned before, by men who said all the right things, but shattered the moment she stopped smiling. So now, she waited to see if Marcus would break the same way. But he didn't. His calm wasn't an act, it was a statement that her hot and cold wasn't going to melt him or freeze him. And slowly something shifted. She started to text first. Her gaze lingered longer. The walls didn't fall all at once, but they softened. Because for the first time she wasn't met with desperation, she was met with presence. She learned that not every man flinches at discomfort. Some stand still. Some pass the trial, not because they fight back, but because they never needed to. And in that quiet strength, Savannah found the one thing she didn't know she was searching for, a man who didn't need to tame her fire because he carried his own. 3. She's battling her past, and you're not the enemy. In Seattle, rain falls like memory, soft, steady, and impossible to outrun. For Nicole, every drop was a reminder of promises once whispered in the dark, only to disappear by morning. The man who said forever didn't mean it. He left when her heart was wide open, leaving behind a silence she learned to fill with work, independence, and a smile that didn't always reach her eyes. By the time Jonathan walked into her life, gentle, kind, eyes full of truth, Nicole had already built her fortress. She liked him. That wasn't the problem. The problem was, he felt too good to be true. And in her world, too good always came with a warning label. Jonathan didn't come with grand gestures. He showed up in quiet ways, a hand on her back when crowds overwhelmed her, listening, truly listening, when she talked about her mother's arthritis or her dream of visiting the Amalfi Coast. He saw her in ways that felt dangerous. Not because he threatened her safety, but because he threatened her story, the one where every man leaves and she survives alone. So she pulled away. One day she called him her calm in a chaotic world. The next, she vanished. No explanation, no goodbye, just distance, like a tide that suddenly decided it loved the shore too much to stay. But Jonathan didn't panic. He didn't flood her phone with calls. He didn't show up at her door with questions. He let the silence stretch, not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough not to pressure her. He understood something most men don't, that sometimes a woman disappears not because you did something wrong, but because someone else once did, and she's still living in the aftermath. So he stayed present. He sent a photo of the rain falling on his porch and simply wrote, "This reminded me of you." No pressure, no demand, just a thread between them, quiet and patient. And that thread, that grace, became her lifeline. She came back, not because he pulled her, but because he didn't. Because in a world where love had always felt like a threat, Jonathan gave her something new, the safety to be broken without being fixed, the space to return without shame. And that, more than any words, taught her what healing could really look like. 4. She's seeing if you'll chase, the stillness that speaks. In the heart of Chicago, where the skyline pierces clouds and everything moves too fast, Olivia had grown used to a certain kind of man. The kind who texted good morning before she even opened her eyes, who noticed the flicker of her silence and immediately flooded it with questions, who mistook her hesitation for an invitation to perform. They didn't mean harm, they just didn't understand. Olivia wasn't testing them to play games. She was testing to see if there was something real beneath the charm, because anyone can hold your hand when you're smiling. But who stays still when you step away? Then came David. He was different in ways that made her nervous. Not because he was intense, but because he wasn't. He didn't try to outtalk the silence. He didn't rush to fix what hadn't broken. When she started to slow her responses, when she cancelled plans with a vague excuse, he didn't spiral into questions or guilt. He simply let her be. Not cold, not distant, just still. And in that stillness, Olivia felt something unfamiliar bloom, curiosity. Not the anxious kind, not the "who is he texting" kind, but the kind that makes you pause in the middle of brushing your hair and wonder, why hasn't he called? Why do I miss someone who hasn't tried to convince me to stay? That absence spoke louder than 1,000 messages. Because David wasn't trying to be the center of her world, he was already the center of his own. She began to feel his presence even in his distance. Not because he pushed, but because he didn't. He wasn't chasing her approval. He was living his truth. And that quiet confidence echoed through the silence between them. It made her think. It made her feel. And soon, the woman who had always held the upper hand started reaching out, not to test, but to connect. Because Olivia realized something no man had ever taught her, that when you're grounded in who you are, you don't need to chase to be chosen. You don't need to shout to be heard. And in a world full of noise, it's the man who knows how to be silent, who draws her closer without lifting a finger. 5. She's afraid you'll see the real her and leave. At a quiet vineyard tucked into the hills of Northern California, Lily made everything look effortless. She hosted wine tastings with a practiced grace, smiled for tourists with eyes that never gave too much away. Her lipstick was always flawless, her posture impeccable, her words measured. To the world, she was a portrait of strength, composed, elegant, untouchable. But late at night, when the lanterns had dimmed and the guests were gone, it was different. That's when Ryan would sit across from her on the porch, the oak trees whispering in the breeze, and say nothing at all. His silence didn't ask for secrets. It just made room. And that scared Lily more than anything, because he didn't try to charm her. He didn't fill the quiet with flattery or pry into her past. He simply looked at her, really looked, and it felt like he could see through the armor she'd spent years crafting. What if he saw too much? The girl who wasn't always so polished, the one who cried in her car when no one was looking, the one who still carried the ache of an absent father, the sting of a love that once called her too much and walked away. She panicked, pulled back, became distant, offered up busy schedules and half-hearted replies. But Ryan didn't waver. He didn't take her retreat as a challenge or a wound to his pride. He kept showing up, in small, steady ways. A cup of coffee left on her porch, a short note tucked into a basket of grapes, a quiet glance across the tasting room that said, "I see you, and I'm still here." No pressure, no rescue mission, just presence. And that, more than any promise, broke something open in Lily. Because for the first time, she didn't feel like she had to earn his affection. She didn't have to perform, pretend, or stay perfectly put together. She could be quiet, she could be tired, she could be real, and he wouldn't flinch. She realized then that the kind of love she feared most, the one that sees everything, was also the kind she needed most. Not the love that fixes, but the love that stays. 6. She doesn't believe she deserves you, and that's not your job to fix. In Denver, the air is thin, and the heart's sometimes thinner. But Camilla, she was anything but fragile. She wore confidence like armor, tattoos that told stories no one dared to ask about, sharp wit that deflected questions too close to the truth, and a laugh that made people forget how lonely she really was. Most men tried to outshine her, tame her, break her down just enough to feel taller. But Elijah didn't try to outmatch her fire. He simply brought his own warmth. He didn't flinch at her sarcasm. He didn't get thrown off by her independence or try to prove that she needed him. He just stood there, steady, sure, and quietly radiant. And that somehow shook her more than any fight ever had. Because deep down, Camila didn't believe she was the kind of woman who got to keep men like that. The good ones, the grounded ones, always left. Or worse, they stayed just long enough to make her feel safe before reminding her why she stopped trusting in the first place. So she did what felt familiar. She pulled away, picked pointless fights, claimed she was too busy, rolled her eyes when he complimented her, and made jokes that cut too deep to be funny. But it wasn't to hurt him. It was to test the story she told herself every day. If he really knew me, he'd walk away too. But Elijah didn't. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't chase her through her fear. He didn't twist himself into someone smaller just to fit into her comfort zone. He stayed whole, gentle but unshakable. He let her spin in her storm until the winds slowed on their own. And then, when the noise quieted, she looked at him and saw something she hadn't seen before. Not pity, not savior energy, but a mirror. A man who didn't need her to be perfect, who wouldn't settle for being needed out of fear, who loved from his strength, not his wounds. And in that reflection, Camila began to rise, not for him, not because he pulled her up, but because he never knelt to meet her doubt. He stood tall and left space for her to join him. 7. She wants you to prove you're different, without saying a word. Atlanta summers are loud, heat rising off pavement, music from open car windows, arguments and laughter floating through the air like old perfume. But for Trevor, the lesson that mattered most arrived in complete silence. Jasmine wasn't like the women he'd known before. She didn't fall easily, didn't smile too long, and never handed out trust like Candy. There was a quiet weight behind her eyes, the kind only carried by someone who had loved deeply and been left just as deeply. She had been promised everything, a life, a future, a forever. And what she got were men who faded when things stopped being easy. So when Trevor came along, patient and real, her instincts kicked in, not to run, but to test. She started slow, a delayed reply here, a vague excuse there, a weekend gone without explanation, not to punish him, but to protect herself. She wanted to see who he was when things weren't convenient, when her smile wasn't freely offered, when the early magic wore off and reality, with all its fears, stepped in. Trevor didn't panic. He didn't send long texts asking what he did wrong. He didn't call 5 times in a row to prove how much he cared. He simply let her be. He went hiking with his brother. He read a book he'd been meaning to finish. He lived his life and left the door open, but didn't hold it wide in desperation. Because he knew something Jasmine didn't yet. The kind of man who is truly different doesn't need to say it. He shows it in how he stays steady while others shake. And when Jasmine returned, it wasn't with suspicion. It was with soft eyes and a quieter voice. She didn't apologize for the space she took. She didn't need to. Because what she really wanted all along wasn't grand declarations. It was proof. Proof that she could pull back without losing everything. That this time, silence didn't mean abandonment. That this man would still be standing where she left him, not waiting, but still willing. And in that calm, in that restraint, she found what the others had only pretended to offer. Someone who didn't chase her heart to win it, but held space for it to walk back home on its own. Conclusion. The frame she can't break. So here's what you need to remember in the quiet spaces where doubt likes to whisper. When a woman pulls away, don't panic, don't perform, don't turn her uncertainty into your unraveling. Let her push, let her test, let her retreat into the storm she's known longer than she's known you. And you? You stay the mountain, not because you're trying to impress her, but because that's who you are, steady, grounded, unmoved by the changing weather. Because she's not just watching your words, she's watching your core.
She wants to know if your strength is real, not loud strength, not ego strength, but the kind that remains when everything else wavers. If your frame stays intact, if your heart remains open but unshaken, she'll feel it. Not in your texts, not in your chase, but in the stillness of your presence. And when the storm passes, when the noise inside her quiets, she won't come back to test again. She'll come back to rest, to trust, to soften. Not because you bent for her, but because you held firm for yourself. That isn't a game. That's love with its armor off and its soul wide open.